Hi, and welcome back to the Learn to Code by Writing Space Invaders course. In this lesson number 10, we're going to finish off writing the array and looping code, which will allow the player to shoot multiple bullets up the screen at the same time. Lesson number 9 started this, but it got a bit long, so we've split it into two. But in this lesson, we'll finish it off and complete the code. So let's get straight into it in lesson number 10. So getting straight back into our Take80 code, I'm going to start by loading in my lesson 9 code, because we're really just going to start working on from there again. Going in there, change to lesson 10, and let's save that then. So I'm going to save that as lesson 10. So again, that keeps everything safe for us, so we can go back through our work. So where we got to, just to recap, we have now taken out our single player bullet object and created this array that's going to hold up to, at the moment, 5 player bullets. So we've now got also got our initialization for the game. So when our game starts and our game loop starts using this tick function, we can see that the very first thing we do is we check if our game needs to be initialized. So remember, using this flag variable. If it does, we go off and initialize our game. And at the moment, that is then initializing this array. So it's actually creating the 5 slots for each of the bullets to take their place. So we create 5 elements inside our array, and again those elements are then indexed or referenced by numbers 1 to 5. Okay, that's called the array index, the number we use to access that element. So our initialize game routine calls our initialize player bullets array function, which sets up all of that. We then signal back to the game that we've done all the initialization, so this block of code won't run a second time. But we've now got to look at how we handle the bullets. So we have 3 functions here. So remember, we split it all off into little functions to make it easier to work with. So we have a function which checks if we're able to fire a bullet. We then have a function which moves the bullets up the screen, or at least updates the position values for the bullets, and then a function which actually draws them on the screen. So we're going to have to modify those functions to make use of our new array, our player bullets array, which contains these 5 bullets. Before we do that then, we're just going to do a bit of tidying up inside this function. What we tend to do in any game is there are sort of 3 main things going on. So we have our game loop here, but within our game loop we have some initialization to do, which we're doing here. So we have our game initialization happening there. We then tend to do various updating of our game. So whenever things move and buttons are pressed, we need to update all the values that are going on that represent the objects inside our game. So when the player presses the left and right buttons, we update the player ship information to go left and right. When somebody presses a fire button, we're going to update our button information. When the bullets need to move, we have to update the player bullet information, and so on. So we have a whole lot of updating going on. And then once we've got everything updated and we've checked for collisions and which things are blowing up and so on, then we need to do some drawing, which we sometimes call rendering the screen. So let's move our function calls into the correct positions here then. So all of these bits here are part of the updating system. So let's move them in here. So we have our player updating, our player bullet updating, and then we have our drawing functions. And part of our drawing functions, of course, is clearing the screen. And we then draw our player bullets and draw our player ship. So let me just space out a bit so we can see it a bit better. So that's just really organizing our code so we can see the main process that it follows. So our tick function starts, we then initialize our game, but we've seen here that we will mask that off from happening a second time. We then update all of the objects inside our code so that everything is checked and ready. Once everything's checked and ready, at that point we know which things need to be drawn, because again, some Space Invaders may have been killed. And we do our drawing function, and then we go round and do the whole thing again. So we end up eventually doing initialization, update, draw, and then we continue doing update, draw, update, draw, update, draw. Okay, so that's just tidying up just a wee bit there, just so we make it a bit more understandable. But let's now concentrate on the three functions which currently don't work, to be honest. So let's start by looking at the draw player bullet function, mainly because that's going to be the easiest one to fix. So we need to find that block of code, and now that our program is starting to get a bit bigger and we've got lots of functions, instead of scrolling around looking for things, there are some handy features in our development system. And again, this is another reason why it's good to split your code up into these functions. If we go up to the little what's called a hamburger symbol, the very top right hand symbol there, and press on that, we'll find that we can get a list of all the functions that are in our code. And if we start typing it into this line here, we can see that we have our draw player bullet function sitting here and our draw player ship function. So if we click on the draw player bullet function and click on that, it will take us straight to that block of code. So it makes it very easy to jump between the bits of our code. And again, another reason why breaking your code up into nice manageable blocks is a very, very good idea. But anyway, we're down here at the draw player bullet function. And we can see at the moment that it is still using that single player bullet object, and then looking at the various variables that are buried inside that to work out what to do. So we need to rewrite this block of code to now work with the player bullets array. So let's have a look at what we're going to do in here. So give ourselves a bit of space. And we know that this block of code handles one bullet. So it first of all checks if the player bullet is active. And if it is active, then it draws it on the screen. And that's really all it does. This active flag that we saw before is the one that tells us whether it needs to be drawn or whether it should be left off the screen, because it's not actually been fired yet. So our code then needs to reuse that same idea, but has to do it for all 5 bullets. So again, we're going to use our for loop, and we're going to have a look at we're going to use our bullet variable, and we're going to say, so for bullet in the range 1 to max player bullets, and then do put in the end for it, and in the middle here, that's where we're going to do the same block of code, but now for each of the bullets in our player bullets array. So what I can do is I can start reworking that code. So we're saying, so So we need to find the correct bullet. So we look in our player bullets array, and then we use the index, which is pointed to by our bullet counter here. So at that point, player bullets, open square brackets, bullet, that now gives us one of our bullet objects. And as we go round our loop, it will first of all access the first bullet object, then the second, third, fourth, and fifth. So we need to check if the bullet that we're currently looking at is active. So in effect, this line is now the same as this line, but using our loop, we will actually get it to check all 5 buttons, sorry, all 5 bullets, sorry. So let's come in after that, and we know that we need to end our if statement. That's the end of our if statement. So once we are then inside our loop, and we've now found that this particular bullet is active, then we need to draw it on the screen. So what I can do is I can simply copy the drawing code from here, and if I paste it in up here and just tab it in one so that it matches up with our current spacing. So we're going to draw the player bullet. So again, all we need to do now is, instead of referencing our single player bullet object, we need to reference the bullet object which is in our player bullets array. So we really just need to copy that bit of code, and that is what replaces our player bullet down here. So we now have our player bullets array picking out our current bullet that we want to look at, again from our for loop counter, and then from then on it's simply looking at the position object and the X value. So we can simply do that with all of these other ones down here. So that's referencing our bullet, and that one, and that one, and that one. And I think also at the end of this, and if I go back into smaller font, you can see that we have our player bullet length one there as well. So we now have our draw player bullet function. It's now using this for loop to work through all 5, and again, by resetting that particular value, we can have 5 or 10 or 2 or however many bullets we want to have now. We can just simply change that number and our software will cope with it. But as we go through each individual bullet object, we can pick it out of our array using this notation. So our array followed by, and then inside square brackets, our index value. That will then give us one bullet object, and then we can look at the various attributes or variables stored within that bullet object, and then do whatever it is we need to do. So this idea of looping through every single bullet, that's what we're going to be doing in each of our functions to make sure that they now work with our bullet array. So have a bit of time, just think through that, get it in your heads, and I'm going to move on now to the other ones, and we'll try and get you to do a bit of the work now as well. So the next function to modify is the one that actually moves the bullets. So again, if I come up here and look at this, we have our function that says move player bullet. Again, well, it says move player BU, but that's what it does say. So if I click on that, that will take us straight to the function we want to work with. So this one again is very, very similar to our draw player bullet function. So again, you can see at the moment here, it's checking to see if that single player bullet object, if its active attribute was set to true. And if it was, then it was going to update the position of the bullet by moving it a little bit up the screen. And then it also did this check to see if that bullet had hit the top of the screen. So in other words, its Y position had gone less than 0. And at that point, this is where it then signaled back to the rest of the software that this bullet had finished traveling up the screen and was then ready to be refired again. So this block of code then, if I just move into view there fully. So we can see that it's a very similar structure to our draw player bullet function, where we are checking if the bullet is active and then doing various things with the bullet. So I want you to have a go now at modifying this move player bullet function so that instead of going with just the single player bullet, it will work through all 5 of the elements in our player bullets array. And again, this one's going to be very, very similar to what we just did with the draw player bullet function. So pause the video here, I'll give you that countdown and we'll see how it all works out for you. Okay, but do give it a go. Don't worry if you are not quite getting it. This is getting to be quite complex stuff now. And again, we're only on lesson 10, so you haven't been programming for very long. But please do give it a go and see where you get to. Let's have a look then at how we can fix this code. So as I said, it's going to be very, very similar to the function just below it there, where we are doing our drawing the player bullet. And in fact, if we want to, this for loop, we can just really copy that. So if we do a Control-C on that, up here, we can paste that in. So we have our 4 player bullets down there. And again, it's going to go then fully around what we were doing before. And let's now, because it's all need to be stepped in by 1, so let's just step all that in by 1. So we've put in our for loop. So again, remember, our for loop creates a variable which we've called bullet here, which is going to do the counting. It's going to start at 1 and count up to this variable max player bullets. And it's going to then execute this block of code, which we know at the moment is wrong, but it will execute that, and every time it goes round, this bullet variable will count up from 1 to max player bullets, and that will let us access then the bits, the various elements of our player bullets array. So looking at this again, so at the moment our code is accessing our player bullet individual object. So that needs to change. So it needs to access our player bullets array, open our square brackets, and the element we are looking at, or the index value we're interested in, is bullet. So that's our counter. And once we say player bullets index value bullet, that will give us an actual object which represents that bullet. And then we're back into our normal thing where we put in our full stop, which that's actually called dot notation. So we use dot notation to access the variable stored inside that object. So we have player bullets bullet dot active. This piece of code, so player bullets square brackets bullet, if I copy that, that's how we now reference the bullet that we're currently interested in. So all of these individual bullet objects can simply be replaced by our new array-based version. So we have player bullets index bullet gives us the object, then our dot notation selecting the position object, dot notation selecting the Y attribute or the Y variable inside that. And then similarly, this player bullet object needs to become now our array-based one, and this player bullet object needs to become our array-based one as well. When we're then checking to see if it's reached the top of the screen, again, it's all simply just changing our player bullet object to our array-based object. So again, that's picking up dot position dot y, then player bullet. Again, change that to our player bullets index bullet, gives us the object, dot active, we set that to false to say that this particular bullet, remember that accesses one of the bullets in our player bullets array, saying that it has now finished its motion up the screen and is ready to be fired again. So that's our move player bullet function fixed. And again, you can see, hopefully, that we're really doing very similar things to each of these functions. The code we'd already written worked with one player bullet, so it was doing all the right things, but we now just need to make it reference the particular player bullet that we're currently working with. And again, our for loop is what changes that index value, which means that we can reference all of the player bullets elements in order. Okay? So again, if you didn't get that the way it was, I've done it there, then have a look through and make sure you match it up with this. And then and also have a good think, and hopefully now you're starting to get the hang of how this is. And it's very much a matter of getting your head around the idea that we have a for loop coming in here. We're no longer looking at a single object, but we have a box. In effect, we've got a box full of objects, and we have to pick out of that box the correct one that we want to work with. And we do that by referencing the box or the array, and then we pick out the correct one by using the correct index value. So we've got one more function to fix. So if I go back up to my outline control over here in the very top right hand corner, a little hamburger icon, and I now want to do the check player fire function. So if I click on check player fire, that will take me up to here. And let's start having a think about how this one's going to work. The check player fire function is slightly different to the ones we just fixed. So let's come in here and give ourselves a bit of space. What we'll do is we will work this. We'll work the algorithm, okay, the method it's going to use. We tend to look at these as algorithms. We'll work out the algorithm using some notes, which is sort of a pseudo code, not real actual code we're going to use, but just sort of like English statements that let us see, but they're structured as if they were code, if that makes sense. You'll see it once we do it. So let's put some comments in here. So what we need to do in this function is we need to have a look and see if the player is pressing the fire button. So our first check will be if the fire button is pressed, then we're going to do something. And what we need to do is we need to find if one of the bullets is ready to be fired. So we need to loop through each of our bullets and check if they're ready to be fired. So we basically need to find a bullet that's ready to fire. If we find a bullet that's ready to fire, then we need to initialize that bullet. We need to mark the bullet as active. And that's basically what's happening down here. So we initialize the bullet and we mark it as active. But what we then need to do is we need to make sure that as our loop continues, we don't find more bullets that are ready to be fired and fire them all off at one go. So we need to find a way of stop other bullets from firing. So this is really what our code's got to do. So it's got to check if a button's being fired. Then it's got to loop through each of the bullets to find one that's ready to fire. If it finds one that's ready to fire, it needs to set its X and Y position on the screen and then tell the system that this particular bullet is active. But then it needs to send a signal that it's found a bullet and fired a bullet, so that will stop other bullets from firing. Okay? So this signal will be picked up somewhere inside this block of code to stop a second bullet being initialized. So why don't you have a go and see if you can get your head around that. What I would advise you to do on this one, because we're going to be playing around with this code quite a bit. This is a reasonably complex bit of code you're going to play about with. What is worth doing sometimes when you're developing code is taking a snapshot of where you are, so that if things go terribly wrong, we can very quickly get back to where you were and then have another go. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to escape out of that, and I'm going to save where I currently am as lesson 10. Check fire. So I know that this is where I was playing about with the check fire function. So let's save that, and then let's go back into our code and have a go and see if you can work out how to do this then. So I'll put on the timer and we'll see how you get on. So let's work through this block of code then. So the first thing we need to look at is if the fire button is pressed. So we know that down in our block of code here, we already are doing that. So that's the bit where we use this btnp command to see if we've got a brand new button press. So let's put that in here. So if button pressed, and the button is number 4 for the fire button, then we're going to start doing some of this code. But down here, this is where we have the end, and that is a if button pressed. So again, it's quite handy, especially if we're working with lots of embedded if statements to mark out which end goes with which if. Okay, so if the fire button is pressed, then we do that. So that's that line taken up with. We now need to loop around finding a bullet that's ready to fire. So again, this is where we're going to be using our loop to work around each of the bullets. So for bullet equals 1, I'm using the comma then to max player bullets do. Right, so that's the same for statement that we used for all of our other bits, our move player bullet and our draw player bullet. So again, we need to work out where the end of that's going to be. So the end of that's going to be here. So that's the end of our for loop. So let me just step that in there so it all makes sense. And these are going to be indented in. So we now need to find a bullet that's ready to fire. So that's going to help us look at each of the individual bullets. So what we need to do now is we need to say if, and we need to look at this particular bullet. So player bullets bullet. So again, that gets us the bullet that we're currently indexing with our counter. Remember, that's how we do it. We then want to look at its active flag. So that will tell us if it is active. So remember what we did last time? Down here, we used that not keyword. So we can say in here, so if the player bullets with index bullet is not active, then, so that's where we found a bullet which is ready to fire. So this is where we're going to need to initialize the bullet and do all these things. But let's just first of all put in our end statement here. So that end goes with the if not active statement. So initializing our bullet, if we have a look down here what we did, we simply set the player bullet position up. So let's do that one first. And let's just step that in. So we are setting, and again, this has got to be the current bullet within the array that we're looking at. We need to set its position up so that it starts at the player ship. So remember this bit of code here. So player bullets array and the element with the index bullet, that becomes our new bullet object that we're looking at. So we are looking at the position object of the correct player bullet, and we're setting its X property to the player ship position plus the player ship bullet offset position. And again, those things don't change. We haven't changed any of that block of the system. And the Y value then is set to the Y value here. So that's the position of the current bullet we're looking at has now been set to the player ship position. So that bullet is now ready to go. So we need to mark that bullet as active. Okay, so this is the bullet. And we need to look at its active flag, and we need to set that to true. So that bullet is now active, and our other code will now start moving it and start drawing it on the screen. But we've now got to handle this bit where it's stopping other bullets from firing. So let's have a think about how we're going to do that. So somehow we've just found a bullet here. So this if statement, that tells us that we have found a bullet that we can use to fire the next bullet with. So we need to now create a signal or a flag that will now tell us that we've actually found a bullet, and we don't need to check anymore. We can just basically come out of our for loop and just ignore checking for any more bullets. So let's create a flag, and we're going to call it bullet fired. And we're going to say that bullet fired will now be set to true. So this is going to say that we have fired a bullet. So we need to work out where we need to test for this then. So this flag is going to stop us checking if any other bullets are ready to fire. So this is where we check if a bullet is ready to fire. So our if statement needs to come in just before that to tell us whether we need to bother doing it or not. So if bullet fired, and we now need to work out which way around this needs to be. So we've said down here that once we've found a bullet and fired it, we're going to say bullet fired will be true. And what that means then is we only do our check for firing if bullet fired is false. So we can either say it is equal to false, then we do this. We now have to indent in our code for this, because we've added an extra if statement. And then we need to end, and that is the end of our if not bullet fired. Okay. One last thing we have to do then. Our bullet fired flag, we haven't started with a value for that. So when we first come in, the system won't know what bullet fired is. So we need to create that up here. And again, this is going to be just a variable which is being used inside our check player fire function. So it wants to be local to our function. And bullet fired, we'll initialize it to false because we haven't found a bullet yet. So hopefully that should be our code. So let's just run through that again. So we only do something if we've got a new fire button press. So that's the first thing we do. We come in here. So if there isn't a button press, then we'll come down here and we'll simply drop out the end. Actually, let me just take out this block of code here, because that's the old code. Let me just take that out. So we are here, right? So if we don't have a button press, then we go down to this end statement and in effect we finish the check player fire one. Nobody's pressed fire, so there's nothing to check for. If we have got a button press, then we start coming into this block. And we start working through each bullet in turn. So each of the bullets in our player bullets array, we're going to work through them one by one, starting at 1 and working up to the maximum number of bullets that we're allowing in the system. So we've created this flag called bullet fired, which we've initialized up here to be false. And what that signals is if we have found a bullet and fired it, or if we're still looking for a bullet. So the way this one works then is bullet fired will be set to false if we're still looking for a bullet, and bullet fired will be set to true if we have found a bullet and fired it. So once we start working our way through the bullets, we then check, have we already found a bullet and fired it? Okay? Or are we still looking for a bullet? So this says if we are still looking for a bullet, in other words, bullet fired has the value false, then we need to go and check to see if this particular bullet can be fired. If our bullet fired is true, in other words, we have fired a bullet, then this expression is going to fail because bullet fired isn't equal to false. And what that will mean then is that if that expression fails, we will simply skip over this block and we will then go around and check the next one. Okay, and each time we go round, it will say, I've already found a bullet, so I don't need to do any of the checks. And it will eventually then finish looking at all the bullets and end the function. So if we have then, if we are still looking for a bullet, we then check to see if this particular bullet, so remember this particular bullet is signified by this expression, so player bullets with the index of bullet. So if this particular bullet we're looking at is not active, in other words it's ready to fire, then we can fire it in effect. Okay, but if this particular bullet is active, then this expression will fail. Yeah, so remember, this expression is checking if it's not active, but if it is active, this expression will fail. In other words, it will give a false value back. Then we simply skip over firing this bullet and go and check the next one. So we initialize. So if this expression passes, in other words, this bullet is not active, then we come in here to execute this. And all we're doing here is same as before. We're taking this particular bullet. So remember our player bullets array and the element with the index bullet, which is going to be our counter. We take its position object and we set the X part of its position to the player ship X position and the Y part of its position to the player ship Y position, again with these offsets we did to make sure it comes out of the actual barrel of our gun. Once we've set the position, we need to tell the system again this particular bullet is now active. So again, player bullets array, the element with the index bullet is now active, and we assign a value. So remember, single equals is assigning a value to it, and we assign a value true. And then the very last bit then is our bullet fired flag, which again is a little flag we're just using inside this function. We set that to true, saying that we have now fired a bullet and we are no longer looking for another bullet to fire. So hopefully your code was a bit like that. If it wasn't, please don't worry, because this is starting to get quite complicated in here. Okay, so check through what you've got and make sure it covers all those points. If not, remember we saved a version of the code just a second ago. You can go and reload that in and then copy out what we've done here. Just rewind the video a bit and follow me through on typing it in. But we should now have all the code we need to get 5 bullets working on the screen at once. And now comes the interesting part, because we've been writing quite a lot of code here without doing any testing. Again, because we couldn't test it because we needed to finish it all before any of it was going to work. So now comes the fun bit of actually getting it to work properly. But before we do that, let's take a bit of a break from this lesson. If you need to rework your code a bit, please go ahead and do that, and make sure you save your work as lesson number 10. In the next lesson, we'll start testing our code, and we'll go through a full process of debugging it. I'll make sure there are certain bugs in our code, and I'll take you through the whole process of how we go through identifying errors and fixing them. So look forward to seeing you in the second part of this lesson, and see you then. Bye. Don't forget to visit the course pages for this project. There you'll be able to download the code for this lesson and get lots of extra hints and tips. You'll also get access to all my other programming, electronics and gaming projects. All the links are in the description below. For more games programming, electronics projects and retro gaming, please make sure you like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel and visit my website.